Well, thank you everyone for joining this morning's session on proactive concept development for grant seekers. We're pleased to have Aaron with us today, all the way from Paris, France. So we're excited about that. Just wanted to share with everybody that um, the contract that we have with Hanover provides all these valuable services that can help you in your scholarship and research. And what that entails is our contract is kind of divided up to where Hanover can work with us on various different means. One being prospecting for potential funders, so the Hanover team can work with you on finding funding opportunities that support your research and your scholarship, as well as like today they also do training. In terms of webinars and frequently come out to campus and give lectures to all of our faculty. So be on the lookout for future trainings that my office will send out to the campus community. And lastly, and more importantly, once a proposal's developed, or excuse me, once a funding opportunity is found, they will work with you on developing your proposal in terms of providing reviews and comments back so that we can incorporate their expertise to make our proposals much competitive. That's the overview of the Hanover contract. You're more than welcome to contact me and sponsor programs, and we can get you in the queue and get you ready to work with our Hanover professionals. So, with that said, I will gladly turn it over to Aaron for today's presentation.
Thank you for that great introduction and for also talking about a few of the services that Hanover provides. So yeah, today we're going to be going over developing your concept and specifically looking at how to develop strong objectives, hypotheses, and concept papers. So this is really just meant to help you get over that initial fear of the blank page. Like if you have trouble starting or if you don't know exactly where you're going, this is going to outline the first few steps to get you going on the first page of your, what will probably become, if you're doing an NIH grant, it will probably become your specific aims page. So how do you construct this? How do you break this down? And this will also be the foundation for requesting meetings with program officers and doing all those next steps that go into preparing a competitive proposal. All right, so today the presentation will likely be a little under 60 minutes. I typically try to make the presentations a little shorter, although I give and I work in a lot of time for questions or for little discussions if you have anything you want to discuss. So we will save some time at the end for questions, but please interrupt me, type your question into the chat at any time. I'm very happy to be interrupted. You won't bother me. You can even unmute yourself and ask a question if you would like. And the slides and a recording will be shared at the end of after today's session. And that's important to note because I will be sharing some slides that have links on them, and you won't be able to follow them today, obviously, because this is a Zoom presentation. But in the copy of the slides that you will get, these will all be active links, and you'll be able to follow them. All right, so this is a little bit about me. So I do come from an academic background in biomedical sciences. My PhD is in neuroscience. I worked at SUNY Stony Brook for quite a while as a professor, and I left that position in order to move to Europe. There was an opportunity for us to move to Europe. So first I lived in London for a couple of years, and then I am now living in Paris, which has been a lot of fun. But I've been really enjoying this opportunity to work with Hanover and do grants consultant work with people like you because it helps me stay engaged with the academic community. And ultimately, I like academics. I enjoy keeping my fingers in this world in some small way. So I've now done proposals in covering all the major federal agencies and also a lot of different foundations. So, yeah. All right, let's get into today's content. What we're going to be starting with is how to frame your research question, how to develop that into objectives and hypotheses, and we'll go into some examples of evaluating hypotheses. We'll go from that into constructing a concept paper with some specific advice about how to construct a specific aims page, which is typically what you would use as a concept paper for NIH. And then we'll end with the Q&A session. And so here are some objectives that we have for today. So by the end of today, you should be able to frame a competitive research question with overarching goals and objectives. You should be able to evaluate the strength of a hypothesis and create an outline for your concept paper. All right, so I'm going to cover, sorry, I'll go back to here. I'm actually going to cover these these first two segments in one segment because they flow logically from one to the next. So framing your research questions. So going from overarching goals to more specific objectives and eventually to hypotheses. All right, so when you're thinking of your great idea, you probably have an overall research question in mind. It might be pretty vague, so I give this as just a hypothetical example. Does exercise influence chemotherapy side effects? That might be your overall question. Obviously, this is pretty broad, so I encourage you as your next step to get a little bit more specific. So here, to get a little bit more specific, you might say something like, do patients with cancer who exercise regularly experience fewer side effects from chemotherapy? This is a little bit more specific. It's not perfect. One of the key questions when you're thinking about an overall research question, to frame your whole study, you don't want to get too into the weeds yet, but there are some important details that you do still want to think about. One of these is a mistake that we see often in proposals. When you use statements like fewer or comparative, more than fewer, when you use comparative statements like that, always remember to include your comparison group. Because here, for example, it isn't clear. Are you comparing these patients and their side effects to themselves before they went through the exercise treatment, or are you comparing these patients to other patients who did not get the exercise treatment? So if I was to critique this a little bit, I would get even a little bit more specific than this and explicitly state the comparison group. All right, once you have your research question, you can start thinking about your overall goal. Your overall goal is where you want to be. It is typically still pretty broad. It gives an overall picture of what you want to achieve in a research proposal, especially when you're an early career investigator. It's a good idea to state your overarching goal. And this is your plan, your goal for your career. What impact do you want to make in your research in this particular research direction that you have? What impact do you want to make over your career? And this helps reviewers get an idea of who you are as a researcher, where you want to go. Does this particular project help get you to where you want to go? And is your overarching goal going to be impactful? Is this something that's worth addressing in the field? So an example, going off of the topic that we covered in the last slide for the research questions, one example of an overarching goal might be this. My overarching goal is to develop non-pharmacological strategies, such as exercise interventions, that improve quality of life and treatment tolerance for individuals undergoing cancer therapy. And then so the overarching goal is optional. I usually recommend it, as I said, especially if you're early career. Again, it just allows reviewers to get a sense of who you are as a researcher. You do, however, want to state a specific goal for the research project. And you can state both, by the way. So you can say something like, my overarching goal is this, and then the goal of this research project is to evaluate whether moderate intensity exercise reduces the frequency and severity of chemotherapy-related side effects in adult cancer patients. Great. All right, so we have an overarching goal. We have a specific goal to the research project. And just to remind you, goals are your big idea, what you endeavor to do, your lofty vision. They're not always measurable. They're often longer term, especially your overarching goal. And they're not often so detailed as to convey how you will get there, what methodology you will use, for example. Now, if you're thinking ahead, you might be thinking about what the next step is, and that is your objectives. And objectives are where you get into some aspects you break down your goals into something that's measurable, and it also starts to convey how you will get there. So your objectives are the next step into getting a little bit more detail behind how you will achieve your goal. So your objectives serve to fulfill the goal behind your idea, to focus your study, to start giving a hint as to the design and methodology of your research study, and to provide measurable criteria that can be used to evaluate your outcomes. So really, all of this is stuff that should be covered on your specific aims page. And on your specific aims page, you should be giving enough information about your objectives and also about each specific aim so that by the time reviewers get to your approach section in your research strategy, nothing should come completely out of the blue. They should already have a pretty good idea of how you're going to approach this problem, what methods you're going to use, what your major outcomes are. Obviously, you have to fill in a lot of details in your approach section, but they should be getting enough of an overall idea of your proposed methodology and outcomes in your objectives that nothing later on in your proposal is going to come as a complete surprise. Okay, so let's go back to our example. And I'll just remind you of what we said our goal was for this example project. So our project goal, our research goal for this project was to evaluate whether regular moderate intensity exercise reduces the frequency and severity of chemotherapy-related side effects in adult cancer patients. Okay, here's an example objective to compare the incidence and severity of common chemotherapy side effects such as fatigue, nausea, and neuropathy between cancer patients who participate in a 12-week moderate intensity exercise program and those who do not. All right, so I created a little checklist for evaluating whether this is a strong objective. Does it directly support the stated goal? So let's take a look. So the goal was to investigate moderate intensity exercise and the effects of chemotherapy side effects. This seems to clearly address that. So I'm going to put a check mark there. Does it define a specific methodology? It does well enough. It does say that you're going to do a comparison study between cancer patients who participate in a 12-week exercise program and those who do not. So that gives me a sense of how you're going to basically construct this study. You're going to have an intervention group, a control group. You might do a crossover design. I'm not sure. That's a detail that can wait until later. I know that the program is going to be 12 weeks. So these are all key methodological details that start to give me an overall picture of what the study is going to be. It does introduce key variables that you're looking at, such as fatigue, nausea, neuropathy. And it sets some parameters. So it specifies that it's a 12-week program. Let's see what other, that's pretty much it. Oh, moderate intensity, but we knew that already from the goal. So it does start to set some parameters. All right, so already when I'm reading this as a reviewer, I'm starting to get a picture of what exactly you're proposing to do. So I'd say that this checks all the boxes on this list. And I like to include checklists like this so that you can use them when you're constructing your objectives and you're going through and writing these things. I have at least, I don't know, I had at least one other checkbox or checklist for you to use as a resource too, but please feel free to go back to these slides later on when you're preparing your proposal and just make sure that you're hitting all these basics. All right, once you have, by the way, I'm going to do a little bit of an aside here. For NIH, typically you have a specific aims page, which breaks the project down into typically 3 aims. It doesn't have to be 3 specific aims. It's just that's what most people do. I've seen 4 aims, I've seen 2 aims, I'm sure I'm even seen 5 aims. So there's not one correct way to do this, but the rule of 3s is pretty strongly followed. But that only will work for you if your project has 3 logical aims. If your project only has 2 logical aims, it doesn't make sense to squeeze out a third. Just propose those 2. All right. So let's assume that your project has 3 aims. Um, you may want to propose an overall objective and an overall hypothesis, and then have specific, more refined objectives and hypotheses for each one of those aims. You may want to just state an overall goal for your entire project and then have specific objective or an overall objective. Sorry, you should still have an overall objective, but you don't necessarily have to have an overall hypothesis, and it may not work for every study. So you may want to propose an overall objective and then have specific hypotheses only for each individual aim. Either approach is fine. You'll see examples going both ways. All right, so here I say this because the way that I talk about it in this presentation, it kind of implies that you give an overall objective and then you follow that up with an overall hypothesis. This is not the only way to do this. You can have specific hypotheses for each aim instead. All right, so let's continue with the presentation. So what forms a great hypothesis? So hypotheses should be logical. They should be supported by the background. They should be testable, and we're going to talk about this a little bit. You'd be surprised how many hypotheses we see as grant consultants that are not testable. It should be focused, and it should be simple. So again, this is going back to logical. So nothing should be a great leap in logic. Even on your specific aims page, you should provide enough background so that the hypothesis, by the time the reviewer gets to the hypothesis, they should say, oh, okay, that makes sense. No real surprise there. That totally makes sense. It sounds interesting, but this hypothesis logically proceeds from from the information that has come before. And I do harp a little bit on hypotheses because, like I said earlier, you'd be surprised, first of all, by how often a lack of a testable hypothesis is pointed out by reviewers as a critique in NIH reviews, even for established investigators. And we also see that. We also see a lot of established investigators who pose hypotheses that are not testable. And then also a strong hypothesis can form the basis for generating great aims. So it really does help you pinpoint exactly what you want to test in your aims. Okay, so let's talk about what I mean by a testable hypothesis. So here is an example of a hypothesis one might pose for the study. It is exercise may reduce the side effects of chemotherapy in cancer patients. All right, so I want to ask you to respond, but you can just think to yourself, do you think this is a strong or weak hypothesis? And what about it do you think makes it strong or weak? What would you change about it? And I'll give you a hint that there are several things that I would, so this is already answering the first part. This is a weak hypothesis. I gave that an answer away pretty quickly. But there are several things. There's not just one thing. There are several things that you would change here to make this stronger. All right. So I see. Yeah, thank you. It is weak. Thank you, Michelle. It is indeed a weak hypothesis. All right. So what I would change here are a couple things. First of all, there's a lot of vague language. So exercise, side effects, you saw in earlier slides that we got much more specific. Thank you. Operationalized side effects is the comment that we got. Operationalized exercise. Yes, exactly. Here again, we're not stating a comparison group. There's one other thing I want to point out that comes up really, really often when we're reviewing grants, which is, oh, sorry, I thought I got one new message, but I didn't. So this word may, hedging words, do not belong in hypotheses. May, could, those kinds of things come up surprisingly often, and they are huge red flags that your hypothesis is not testable. All right, so why does this mean that it's not testable? It's because you're hedging. You're saying that maybe it will, maybe it won't. Like you have to make a declarative statement that exercise will reduce the side effects of chemotherapy, blah, blah, blah. You can be more specific, as we said, but exercise will affect the specific side effects of chemotherapy in cancer patients compared to those who did not. And you may want to, in order to make that kind of statement, you may need to add some more detail about the types of conditions under which this effect will be seen. But my point is that this word may has no place in a hypothesis. So here, this is an example of how one might change this. So regular moderate intensity exercise will significantly reduce self-reported fatigue and nausea in adult cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy compared to those receiving usual care. All right, so we have more details. We added more details about the type of exercise, the type of side effects, the type of patients, the comparison group, and we put will. Now be careful. I've started to see sometimes that people will put in hypotheses, they'll use the wording will be able to, and that's also hedging. So just say will, keep it straightforward. This effect will happen under these conditions. So keep it very, very straightforward like that. Avoid, if you're having to hedge, or if you're like a little bit, if it doesn't make sense to use the declarative language like will, then we have to think about either reframing the hypothesis or considering whether this is truly hypothesis-driven work. And I do want to touch on that. I think that's coming up in the next slide, but let me just see, sorry. So this hypothesis is specific and testable. You will be able to see, you can test this effect if you see that exercise does reduce these effects. This will support your hypothesis. If you find that it does not, then that will refute your hypothesis. It is falsifiable. All right, yeah, so this is the next slide. Are hypotheses always required? This is also a common mistake that we see in a lot of proposals. I think some people have gone a little bit overboard with saying that NIH reviewers always expect hypotheses. It depends on the type of study that you're doing. So I imagine that most of the studies that you are proposing would be hypothesis driven, but I'm not sure. So these are examples when hypotheses are expected. If you're doing experimental studies, data-driven comparisons. So for example, this study that we've been talking about the whole time, does group A differ from group B? That's an example where a hypothesis would be expected. Now, when I'm talking to engineers, when I'm looking at engineering proposals a lot of time, I often find that they're trying to fit in hypotheses where a hypothesis doesn't fit. So I don't know if anyone falls into this work. So a lot of anything where you're doing any modeling, tool development, simulation-based studies, then I would encourage you to focus more on research objectives and resist the urge to try to jam a hypothesis into this kind of study, because your objective is not to test a research hypothesis. It is to develop a tool that meets certain criteria. So for example, this is maybe not the best example, but I use this to illustrate the concept. So here would be an example of a study where a hypothesis would not be appropriate. Our objective is to develop and refine a tracking tool to support symptom monitoring during chemotherapy. And then you would indicate clearly what criteria you would use to judge the success of this tracking tool so that NIH reviewers have a clear idea, and particularly program officers have a clear idea of how they'll be able to judge your success at this project. This is why hypotheses are so appealing, is because it gives you a clear metric by which NIH staff are able to determine whether your project has been successful. If your work is not hypothesis driven, you still have to give them this clear indication of how they can judge whether your project has been successful. But that will become, perhaps in this example, like I said, a list of criteria that you will be trying to meet, like, I don't know, accuracy, validity, whatever you're trying to do in this study. Also, if you're proposing qualitative research, a hypothesis is not appropriate for qualitative research. So I guess here, when I exploratory work, maybe that would be better if I replace this with qualitative research. Okay. So bottom line, whether or not you are proposing hypothesis-driven work, strong research objectives are a must. They should be specific, they should be actionable, so they should clearly describe what the project and what each aim within the project will do or produce. So again, how will people be able to judge whether this is successful? And I've repeated myself so much, I apologize for all the repetition, but it's because it's important. It's really worth emphasizing. This is, again, another thing that comes up surprisingly often as something that a lot of grant writers don't do very well, or comes up in the reviewer's critique, that they don't have specific outcome measures that can be evaluated to determine whether the project was successful. And also, good research objectives should be grounded. They need to be tied to a meaningful question or a need in the field. All right, I'll pause for a few seconds, 30 seconds or so, and just see if you have any questions on the first part before I go through our section on preparing concept papers or specific aims pages. And if you're thinking about your question and you want to type it into the chat, go ahead. Oh, I got a question. All right. Where do SMART objectives come in? Okay, so SMART objectives are specific, measurable, actionable. R is what? Remind me what R and T are. Pam, do you mind? Oh, you're muted. Relevant, thank you. And the T is testable. No,
realistic, and then time limited.
Time limited, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So specific,
right.
SMART objectives. Thank you for bringing that up, because I didn't include a slide on SMART objectives. But yes, so SMART objectives are specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time limited. Great. So yeah, so going back to the objectives, I think that's good advice. I didn't use exactly that language, but I think that's also a good marker of what objectives should be. So we need to here, we have specific, I talked about measurable, but I didn't explicitly name it here, but we can add measurable, actionable. I would say grounded is also realistic. So grounded, make sure it's tied to the need, make sure it's realistic for you to be able to do. And time limited. So you do want to be aware of how much you are proposing in an NIH grant proposal, because I know I've been talking about all these common problems. Another common problem is that reviewers will often say that a proposal is too ambitious. So you do want to make sure that your specific research objectives are ones that can be achieved in the project timeline. You can have broader goals that are your long-term goals, as we talked about before, but your specific research objectives should be fully realized within the project duration. So don't include research objectives that are things that you plan to do in your next proposal. And we do occasionally see that. And you will also, later on in your proposal, in your research strategy, where you write up the full description, you will include a timeline to just confirm that you are proposing work that is doable within the project timeline. Thanks for bringing up SMART objectives. I appreciate that. Okay, so preparing concept papers and specific aims pages. The concept paper. So one essential part of the proposal development process is to talk about your ideas with program staff. This is highly, 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 highly recommended for any federal agency that you're working with. It is an expected step with federal agencies, This isn't to say that you're necessarily going to get a rapid response from a program officer, but you should keep trying. And this is something that you are expected to do. And this is something that program officers do as part of their jobs. So so in order to approach a program officer, I don't want to get too off track here. This isn't a conversation about program officer outreach. We do have some resources on that though. If you would like to learn more, we have a really great guide for program officer outreach that walks you through the whole process. But let's get back.
Erin, I think that's something we wanted in early fall.
Okay,
So
great.
I'm glad you said that.
Good. Yes, it's a very useful webinar to attend as well. So if you have a chance to attend the program officer webinar, I find it gives a lot of very concrete advice about how to go about presenting your work to them, how to have a productive conversation, and how to interpret what they say as well. So it's one of my favorite webinars to give. So the concept paper. This is what you will prepare to present your idea to a program officer or to program staff. Oh, I was going to say, program staff aren't always available, especially if you're looking outside of federal agencies, but you always want to try. You always want to try to find somebody to talk about your ideas with before you go through the whole process of preparing your entire application. All right, so a concept paper may be generic or tailored to a particular funder. I generally advise you to tailor it to a particular funder. For agencies like NIH or NSF, they're expecting to see a one-page document that's similar in format to the specific aims page for NIH or to the project description or the project summary, sorry, for NSF. So it's a one-pager, it's an overview, it's in a standardized format that they're used to seeing. It has all the key bits of information there. This is what they're expecting to see. If you are shopping around for multiple smaller funders like foundations or corporate funders, then I generally still recommend that you create a one-page concept paper because usually people are not looking to read much more than one page. But depending on the complexity of your project and what they're looking for, a concept paper may be up to 5 pages. But just remember that try to keep this short because you do want people to actually look at it. And the concept paper is just a starting point for a conversation with funders. So it's just to get your foot in the door to start a conversation. And the real intent of a concept paper is to initiate a larger conversation. So the simple concept paper, this is for maybe any funder outside of NIH or the big ones. So if you're proposing your idea to the funder and it doesn't have clear guidelines on what they expect for the equivalent of a specific aims page, you might want to follow a format like this. You start with a summary, a quick summary. You describe the need for the work and a little bit of background that goes into justifying the need of the work. Keep this focused and short and to the point. List your goals and objectives. Describe your main activities. Finish the research. So all of this is like the research part of your proposal. So conclude the research part of your concept paper with an impact statement. What is the overall impact of this work? Why should the funder get excited about this and want to fund it? Then you can include a little blurb on the qualifications of you and your research team as it pertains to the research project. And then specify any other important details, like, for instance, any unusual budget requests or collaborations. I would say that for a specific aims page basically follows it meets these 5 criteria, although they aren't exactly called this, but generally these 5 criteria are covered in a specific aims page. You wouldn't normally talk about qualifications in a specific aims page, and you wouldn't normally talk about these kinds of details in a specific aims page unless it's important. Like, for instance, when I was a professor, I one of my grants, I proposed an engineering. I was a neuroscientist. I was collaborating. It was a multiple PI project that I was doing with an engineer to test this device that we had co-invented. And in that case, it was important to highlight that this was a multiple PI proposal between a mechanical engineer and a neuroscientist. So that was an important detail. So I just mentioned that quickly and then move on the specific aids page. So if you have important collaborations that are essential to the project, you might want to touch on them. The other thing I was going to say for the concept paper, this is not for the final specific aims page, but for the version of the specific aims page that you're using as your concept paper. You would want to include a short note on any unusual budget requests because you will want to make sure that comes up in your conversation with the program officer. So if you're requesting something beyond the typical award amount, like if it's quite a bit higher than what is normally given, or if you have an unusual request that you'll need to get approval for, like maybe equipment, or now like international collaborations are uncertain. Like let's just say that they're evolving. The rules around international collaborations are evolving. So if you have any international collaborations, you may want to discuss that and include that as part of your concept paper so that you can figure out whether this is going to be realistic and what you have to do early on in the proposal development process. All right, tomorrow you have a presentation, a webinar on grant writing versus academic writing that I highly recommend. I think it's a very important topic. So grant writing is typically more sales pitching than academic paper writing. You're also writing for a more general audience. A concept paper takes that even further. It's even more of a sales pitch, and it's even more of a general audience that you're targeting. You're targeting a program officer, which is very much a generalist. A program officer requires a lot of detail about the field, but it's really just a general knowledge overall of the field. So keep it general, keep it plain language, highlight areas that are likely to capture a funder's attention, and those are areas that are aligned with their funding priorities. Focus on need and impact. Include just enough detail about the methodology that the funder knows that you're serious and it gives confidence that you know what you're doing. So the ratio of, balance selling and telling, but you're going to do more selling than telling in the concept paper. And especially for smaller funders, use emphasis to bring attention to key elements. And this is really your elevator pitch or your elevator speech. So just think about that. How are you going to show the reviewers that this is well aligned with, the funder? How are you going to show the funder that this is well aligned with what they want to fund? All right, now I've been talking about concept papers kind of generally, but also specifically talking about NIH specific aims pages. And that's because I know that most of you are biomedical researchers and so are targeting NIH. And then also a lot of the health-related foundations follow NIH formatting generally for their applications. So this has broad application to any biomedical funder beyond NIH as well. But that being said, be sure to read the specific instructions as well. But I'm going to dive in the last little bit of the presentation. I'm going to dive in a little bit more specifically into the specific aims page and what you can do to make this as strong as possible. So this is arguably the most important part of the application. So many, as I said, many biomedical research funders follow this format, but some will have unique requirements and try to speak to a program contact when guidance is unclear. With your specific aims page, start this early. It takes multiple revisions. It really does need to be refined over and over and over and over again throughout the proposal development process. Get lots of feedback. There are excellent resources. I should link to our Hanover Grants Resource Center because we do walk you through the process of writing a specific aims page and a research grant for NIH. So that's an excellent resource, and I link to that at the end. There's also this very good resource. It's a little bit old now, but it's still very good. It's called The Anatomy of the Specific Aims Page. And I'm going to use their approach to break down a couple of segments of the specific aims page in the following slides. And then the last resource I wanted to point you to is NIAID sample applications. In general, NIAID, this is Allergies and Infectious Diseases at NIH, the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases. They have some excellent resources for grant seekers to guide you through every step of the process that are very useful. Even if you're not targeting this institute for your application, it's broadly applicable to anybody who's looking for NIH funding. And one of the really great things that they do is they provide sample applications along with the, so they'll provide the whole sample application, and they'll also provide the reviews alongside this. And they've done that for a lot of different NIH mechanisms. So really, when you're looking to prepare an application, look at this link and see what other people have prepared. All right, so we're going to talk about the first paragraph and the last paragraph of the specific aims page, but then I also point you to these resources and also the Hanover Grants Learning Center. Sorry, I think I said the Grants Resource Center. It's the Hanover Grants Learning Center as well. So use these resources to get the idea of how to write the overall specific aims page. We just don't have enough time today in today's webinar to cover everything that you should include in a specific aims page. So we're going to talk about the first paragraph and the last paragraph. So the first paragraph is the hook. So this is where you're going to introduce your research subject and catch their attention. So there are 4 components that you want to basically cover in this first paragraph. The first is, like I said, the hook, like why should people be interested in it? What is generally known in this topic? Where is the significant gap in knowledge that needs to be addressed? And what is the critical need for this work? You can even use like gap in knowledge, critical need. These are keywords. You can use them in your specific aims page and underline them for emphasis, and reviewers will be looking for this information. So just if you can use this exact language, underline it, they'll be able to find exactly where it is. All right, so in this case, sorry, I should have animated this one at a time. I'll talk about this part down here first. So I just wanted to acknowledge this grant that I grabbed this text from up here. This is one of the proposals that was shared through the NIAID website that I linked in the last slide. So you can see here that they include not just the full application, but also the summary statement. So you can see the feedback that this PI got. They also indicate what forms were used to prepare this application, and that's important because there's going to be some older applications that are posted here that will not be current and will not follow the current requirements for NIH formatting. So you just have to realize that when you're looking at these applications, they may be out of date, and the rules might have changed since then. So just be aware to not follow them exactly and still look at the rules that apply at the time of your submission. Okay, so here's the text. SA, I'm not going to say this. SA is the leading cause of invasive bacterial infections in the US, despite its status as a priority target for vaccine development. All SA vaccines tested to date have been unsuccessful. One consistent barrier has been the lack of reliable translational animal models that predict vaccine protection in humans. Given the impossibility of controlled human infection models of invasive SA infections, we have sought to define the adaptive host response following natural invasive SA disease in children and older adults through models that best recapitulate the natural human host environment. Okay, so what I want to do is go through and look at these 4 things and show how they're represented here. Sorry, I went through that really, really fast. I didn't give you a chance to think about it. I meant to pause there for a second. But maybe here, I'll go back. Maybe you can pause the recording at this point and take a look and see if you can identify them. Just forget the color coding that I showed you in the next slide. So you can pause here, see if you can identify these things. And then here, this is what I've identified. So the hook is that SA is a leading cause of bacterial infections. This second sentence also seems to be kind of the hook, and it also gives you an idea of the overall status of the field. So in the first paragraph, of your specific aims. Don't get too detailed. Just tell the reviewers like just the minimum they need to know to understand the importance of this work. In your second paragraph, I'm not going to talk about the second paragraph, but the second paragraph is typically where you give a little bit more of that background. There is a gap in knowledge. They use the term consistent barrier. That also works. I would underline this to emphasize it a little bit more so reviewers can easily see it. But yeah, so that's clearly identifying a consistent a barrier or gap in knowledge. And this last part is indicating the critical need. I would even put the language critical need in there, but obviously this got funded without it. All right. One thing I do want to mention is that when you're writing NIH applications, resist the urge to give a lot of background information about the prevalence of whatever disease you are targeting, if you are targeting a disease, because that's something that everybody does, and also reviewers know this, especially if it's like a really common disease like stroke or like I used to work with like with people who were doing research. Well, my research used to touch on aging and strokes and things like that. And I would review grants, and I remember one of my reviewers once saying that if she ever hears one more time in a grant application that 800,000 Americans every year have a stroke, she's just gonna go crazy. So like resist the urge to give all this standard background information. NIH reviewers are going to know that stroke is a major problem. Try to get into, I mean, you can do a tiny bit of that, but very quickly get into the exciting thing, the hook that is specific to your project. So try to avoid being too general. All right. So as I said, we're going to jump to the last paragraph now. And actually, I'm going to pick a different grant for this last paragraph because, you know, one thing about these example proposals, even though they got funded, they're not perfect. And that's to show you that a proposal doesn't have to be perfect in every way to get funded. It has to be interesting and compelling and doable. But one of the critiques that I had of this specific aims page from this proposal is that it did not end with an impact paragraph at the end. It listed the 3 specific aims and then it just stopped. And we see that a lot too. So with your specific aims page, don't stop at the end of your last aim. Write a final short paragraph indicating the overall outcomes. So that's why I pulled this other grant here, which is about innate immunity against viral infection in intestinal epithelial cells of C. elegans. All right, so this can be short. This is her paragraph. And in the final impact paragraph, we're looking for a summary of the innovation, the expected outcomes, and the overall impact that this project is likely to have. Okay, so I would say that this paragraph doesn't go into a lot of detail about the innovation. If this was an R21 application where innovation is really rated highly as one of the criteria, I would definitely emphasize the innovation a little bit more. What I imagine, though, is that there's probably something about this approach from doing the whole animal to the molecular level. There's probably something innovative about this approach. So I just took a guess here that there's probably something here to highlight about innovation that reviewers might understand. But this could be highlighted a little bit more if I was to critique this. The expected outcomes is here. They will determine how this simple animal fights off natural viral infection of intestinal cells. And then this is a long-term impact. So they're doing this study in a worm. This could translate into antiviral defense in humans. So they do make that final sentence of why NIH should care about this research in worms.
Erin?
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to use the word may there, or would it have been stronger? The factors and mechanisms we identify may provide, because they don't know, but
yeah,
their hypothesis might be.
So since this is, thank you for bringing that up. So the word may is used here, and I'm fine with that. And actually, I prefer that because this is a long-term impact. This is not an impact of this specific study. This is what might happen in the future, but there's several steps between this and that. So it is uncertain whether this will indeed provide insight into antiviral defense in humans, but they're suspecting that it may make one of the steps building towards that. So they show a direction, but they don't show like false confidence that this absolutely will provide insight into antiviral defense. So you want to,
Because it may be that they don't find that this identifies insight, and then they'll want another grant
yes,
to try something else. Okay.
exactly. Yeah. And then this, I'm not going to, I just wanted to give this is really something I intended for you to have for your own records when you're going through either an example specific games page, if you want to pull one off of that NIAID site, or when you're evaluating your own specific games, you can use this as a checklist to see if you're covering all these different components of a specific games page. Okay. And I'll let you think about any questions that you might have. And I'll cover a few resources as we get close to the top of the hour here. One I wanted to mention is the Grant Rant, which you can get on wherever you get your podcasts. It's a Hanover Grants podcast that includes a lot of insights from our wonderful team of grants consultants and other staff on various issues. Lately, given the changes that are rapidly happening with the federal funding climate, we've been talking a fair bit about these changes, and then also how to find, like, if you're nervous about the funding cuts that have been happening with NSF and NIH, we also talk about some alternatives to the federal funding sources that you may want to check out. That said, I don't want to discourage you from seeking federal funding because it still is the largest source of research funding that you can tap into. So it's still, I think, worth trying. All right, this is our Grants Learning Center that I referred to, and you can access it here using this link. And it includes all kinds of agency-specific advice for NIH and NSF, and also a lot of general grant preparation advice. So regardless of what you're preparing, I suggest going to the Grants Learning Center and seeing what resources are there, because I imagine you can find something to help you create your narrative and find some helpful tips. For NIH and NSF, it's particularly good because we really do walk you through the process of creating your research strategy or your project description. So we talk about each component. We give you an outline, which is particularly important for NSF because they often don't give you a set outline. But we walk you through an outline and tell you what should be covered in each different part. This is an example. Oh, sorry. Another resource are the Hanover Grants calendars, which we prepare. We put out these on different topics every month, and different topics are covered each month. So you kind of just have to wait until your topic comes around. But we have specific grants calendars on health research, on education research, on STEM research, also on programs, on other more specific areas where it's maybe a little bit harder to find funding. Here's an example of a grants calendar we put out recently on non-federal funding opportunities, in case you're looking for that. And I put in some logic. I didn't cover logic models in this presentation because I understand that you already covered that elsewhere. But I thought I would include some resources just in case any of you need this, because this is often something that people struggle with. If you're proposing a programmatic project, these can be good. Logic models aren't typical in standard biomedical research grants, so it depends on your field, though. All right, let me take a look. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I got a few comments, and thank you. We have Alex put in some links to the podcast, and then also to some webinars that we have given in the past. Thank you for that, Alex. Any other questions? Here.
I'm putting my contact information in the
Thank
chat.
you, Alex. I just realized on the last slide that I didn't put the correct contact information. I'm so sorry. I think that's the first time that has happened.
It's the last thing that we see, and I'm sure it's the last thing
Yeah.
to think about when you're
Yes.
developing these materials. So no worries.
I'll correct that in the slides that I send out to everybody, so it will be corrected in there.
This was very helpful. Although it was quick, you had a lot of really rich information that just sort of reminds folks, hey, this is what I need to do for the concept paper. And I think the resources too will help folks since we have people coming from different disciplines or different sectors.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, so this is meant, yeah, I'm glad that you found this helpful. This is a